Okay, I would like to welcome everybody to the webinar and apologize that I wasn't here for the last 2 weeks. I'm back now and I'll be hosting the webinar for the rest of this semester. The Zoom link will change next week, and I will make a note of that in the circular that I send out to everybody. And that will be the new Zoom link from now on. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Redmond Stein from Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Red is finishing a PhD at Lamont, and he's got a report on the work involving Waggle in Northeast Greenland. Over to you, Red. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, like Ray said, my name is Red. I'm a third-year PhD student at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And today I'm going to be presenting some of my work on reconstructing past Holocene climate in Wandel, Northeast Greenland. So this work is part of a much larger cross-institutional collaboration between some of the scientists pictured here as part of the larger NSF-funded Wandel project, also in collaboration with archaeologists at the Greenland National Museum. Today, I'm going to be talking mostly about my work within this project, but also the motivations of the project as a whole, some of my colleagues' work, and some forward-looking projects that are on the horizon. So to kind of introduce you to the region we're broadly interested in here is Inutoqqaq Nunaat, formerly known as Pearyland, which is shown on the black box on the left, zoomed in on the right. Some places to note that I'm going to be mentioning throughout this talk are, of course, Wandel, which is this valley in the red box, as well as Independence Fjord, labeled right here. You guys can see my cursor, yes? Great, labeled here. So this region was settled by ancient pre-Inuit people around 3 times over the course of the last 5,000 years. The first period of settlement began around 4,400 years ago, based on our best estimates from radiocarbon dating of lithic tools from the Independence culture. This is kind of the North Greenland counterpart to the Sakak culture, both descendants of the Arctic small tool tradition. These people arrived, as I said, around 4,400 years ago and stayed till around our best approximation of abandonment 3,700 years ago, although there was probably a period of settlement that was shorter within that range. We just have this large uncertainty on either side due to the uncertainty of the radiocarbon dates. So these people came and left, followed by another period of settlement from the Greenlandic Dorset people, beginning around 2,700 years ago and lasting around 400 years. Similarly, there is some uncertainty there with the radiocarbon dates. And finally, by the Thule people around 700 years ago, beginning somewhere between 12 and 1300 CE. This occupation was likely much shorter, and whereas the Independence people and Greenlandic Dorset people really settled down and made a home here, the Thule people likely used the site more intermittently. So again, we're talking here mostly about Wandel, which has a really high concentration of archaeological sites from these groups, particularly the Independence and Greenlandic Dorset people on the northwest coast of this large lake system. So this is zooming in on Wandel. I'll be talking about these lakes and this valley as a whole. For anyone unfamiliar with Greenland, this is not a friendly landscape. I'm showing here a picture from, I believe, the field season in 2022. You can see that it's incredibly barren. There is really not a lot of vegetation. There are hunting resources like musk oxen and caribou, as well as Arctic hare, Arctic fox, Arctic char in the lakes, etc. But this region is really vast. Those resources are really spread out. And so it's kind of miraculous that people were able to survive here at all, especially with such limited tools relative to what we have today. Of course, there's also months of polar night every year, accompanied by an incredibly harsh winter. And so we're really curious as to why people came here, why they settled here, and of course, also why they left. So kind of a relic hypothesis for why people spread into Greenland in the first place was proposed by H.P. Steensby around 1910. who suggested that pre-Inuit cultures were following muskoxen, prey animal, from the Canadian Arctic into Greenland. This hypothesis was proposed prior to extensive archaeological work being done in the area and was more a proposal for why people spread into Greenland as opposed to this area in particular. But archaeological work has shown that muskoxen were an incredibly important resource in this area. For anyone who doesn't know what muskoxen look like, this is what they look like. They're very large herd prey animals. And they were an incredibly important resource to the Independence One people. They likely used their hides for clothing, for covering their tents to stay warm, for food, of course. And marrow was likely an important source of fuel as well as a way of waterproofing hides. So the Steensby hypothesis has been slightly debunked over the years because we know now that pre-Inuit culture spreading into Greenland as a whole made use of lots of resources, including marine resources like seals and whales, and they were not relying primarily on muskoxen. But we do want to know if muskoxen migration and population dynamics significantly impacted habitability at Wandel in particular. On the left, I'm showing an archaeological study from Jensen and Gottfredson, who showed that they took inventory of bones found at different features around the Wandel landscape and Inutoqqaq Nunaat as a whole, and found that muskoxen were really heavily represented at all of these sites, although there was some reliance on Arctic hare, Arctic fox, the other resources I mentioned that were available to these people. And we know from the fact that these are not boating people, that stable ice would have been really critical for migration, both for muskoxen and the Independence people for getting into this site. So that's something to consider as well. I won't talk too much about the Greenlandic Dorset occupation, but they relied on similar resources as the Independence One people and also would have required landfast ice or stable sea ice for getting into this region. However, the Thule people are quite different. So the Thule people are a whaling culture, and we can see evidence for that on Northeast Greenland. Here I'm showing on the left an umiak or woman's boat that was found on the northeast or northwest shore of Independence Fjord, which I mentioned earlier, as well as some tools on the right that are made from whalebone. Our archaeological findings suggest that hunting of whales and narwhal and bearded seal and ring seal were critically important for the Thule people. They also made use of terrestrial resources, but were fundamentally using those marine sources more. And interestingly, this umiak that was found on Northeast Greenland was made of spruce and larch driftwood, baleen, ivory, and iron nails, which suggests some contact with Europeans. There are signs of alteration and repair, and the archaeological interpretation is that these materials, the way it's been built, and the repairs that have been made suggest that it wasn't made on site, that it was likely actually sailed from the northwest part of Greenland, perhaps over top, and into Independence Fjord. This is a fundamentally different, or would require a fundamentally different sea ice configuration than we have today. And so this is something to consider when we think about why are the Thule people here and how did they get here. So when considering the past habitability of Wandel as a whole, I'm kind of relying on this simple schematic interpretation, which is that within some ideal climate threshold, there are abundant resources and the ancient people's resilience to climate change is quite high. So you can have fluctuations within a certain range, but because there are enough resources to support a population, whether that means hunting resources or sea ice migration routes, these people are able to survive those conditions. However, once a threshold is passed such that resources are so depleted that living here is significantly more challenging, those climate fluctuations have a much larger effect on the population and perhaps leads to site abandonment. But something to consider, of course, is that different cultures, as I've just shown, are adapted to different conditions. And identical climate trends might not necessarily produce identical trends in settlement or abandonment. So a warming, for example, might not have the same effect on the Greenlandic Dorset people and their ability to live in this landscape and thrive compared to the Thule people. So our overarching goal then is to combine archaeological findings, which kind of touches on resilience, for lack of a better term, with new reconstructions of past climate and resource availability to kind of form a holistic understanding of human migration and settlement trends in Wandel over the past 5,000 years. And lucky for us, as I showed, we have this large lake system that we can use to extract lake sediment. There have been 2 field seasons to this site so far, one in 2022 and one this summer, to extract lake sediment cores, which we're using as our basis for past climate reconstruction. So here I'm showing a zoomed in version of this lake system. This large lake here is Nedra Midsummer Lake, or Nedra Midsummer Sioux, as I'll call it for the remainder of the presentation. I'm showing our coring sites in these orange arrows. These 2 little suns are denoting the cores I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. So we have cores from this much larger lake and also cores from this much smaller lake on the side. This is Late Summer Sioux Lake. This is actually ideal because, as you can tell from just this picture alone, these 2 lake systems are very different. They're going to have different climate sensitivities. They're going to accumulate proxies, proxy molecules in different concentrations. And so we can ask different questions using these different lake sediment records. All right, so with these cores, we then take a very multi-proxy, multidisciplinary approach to understanding that kind of three-prong climate, resource availability, and resilience. In terms of climate, we look at things like diatoms, alkenones, the sedimentology of our lake sediment cores, and leaf wax isotopes to understand things about lake ice cover, water temperature, surface runoff or glacial meltwater input, and sea ice extent. In the case of water isotopes, that's going to take some interpretation, but we imagine that water isotopes and rainfall and thus leaf waxes in this region are going to be highly sensitive to sea ice extent off the coast. In terms of understanding resources, we can use sea ice modeling to get at, of course, sea ice migration routes, fecal steroids to get at muskoxen dynamics, and sedimentary DNA to kind of understand animal and vegetation histories in this area. And then in terms of resilience, we have, of course, archaeological surveys. I'm not going to be talking about all of this. This is a lot of work being done by a lot of different people. I'll just be focusing on the things that I've had a small hand in, which mostly include the climate reconstructions relating to lake ice cover, water temperature, and glacial meltwater influx or surface runoff, as well as kind of a novel application of this new proxy trying to get at muskoxen dynamics in the area. So here I'm showing our 2 age models from Late Summer Sioux on the left and Nedra Midsummer Sioux on the right. As a reminder, very different lakes. Late Summer Sioux is only 8 meters deep approximately. Nedra Midsummer Sioux is 40 meters deep. But from both of them, we get very, very well-constrained ages for the last approximately 7,000 or 8,000 years for each record. That's using a combination of terrestrial and aquatic macrofossils, which is kind of amazing given the barrenness of the landscape in this area that we were able to do this. So those are our age models. And as I said, we're kind of asking different questions using these different lake systems. So from Nedra, we're going to be looking at alkenones to reconstruct past lake water temperature and diatoms to get at lake ice cover. From Late Summer Sioux, we're also going to be using alkenones to get at lake water temperature. But that lake water temperature is going to have quite a different response to air temperature than the much larger Nedra Midsummer Sioux system. Diatoms to also get at lake ice cover, leaf waxes, fecal steroids, and sedimentary DNA to get at isotopes and precipitation, and muskoxen dynamics. Lucky that we have this small lake because these leaf waxes, fecal steroids, and sedimentary DNA are much more concentrated in this region, or we expect it to be much more concentrated in these sediments than it would be in such a large and dilute lake system like Nedra Midsummer Sioux. All right, so with that, I'm going to get into showing some data. So first, I'm going to present the diatom records, which were put together by Bianca Perrin at the British Antarctic Survey. Here, I'm showing our record for Late Summer Sioux. The majority of the variability in this record is driven by changes in the relative abundance of Storacera, which is shown right here on the left. This diatom thrives in a low light, ice-covered environment. So we interpret a decrease in Storacera relative to the other taxa shown here as a suggestion that ice cover decreased. So we see that there's a period of decrease in ice cover from around 5,400 years before present to 3,400 years before present. I'm also going to put a little arrow there because I sometimes find these diagrams confusing to interpret. If we look at Hills N2, this is a measure of diatom diversity, and PC1 variance as a whole. We see that both of them are essentially entirely dominated. Their signal is dominated by changes in Storosira. So for Hills N2 and PC1, we interpret up or to the right in this case as less ice. So we have less ice at 5,400 years before present, more ice starting around 4,700 years before present, another decrease or warming period after that, and then finally at around 3,400 years, we anticipate fairly consistent ice cover. The Nedra Midsummer Sea record looks quite different. So here I'm showing that the two main diatom species we're looking at are Storosira and Storosorella, which both thrive in low light ice covered environments. This assemblage, so I've been told by Bianca, is fairly typical of a deep, high Arctic lake. We also note that there are no diatoms prior to 6,400 years before present. We interpret this as being a result of really high influxes of glacial melt. If we look at our calcium counts from this time period, they are extraordinarily high compared to the rest of the record. So we expect that this environment was really turbid, very low light, which is not ideal for our diatom species. So we have no diatoms prior to 6,400 years, and we see that there's really no major step change at 5,400 years like we saw in our late summer Sioux record. We do see a major change in species distribution, or just the relative amounts of Storosira and Storosorella at around 3,400 years before present. But that doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what's happening with the ice. And this just kind of, again, points to the fact that these two lake systems are very different. Whereas Nedra Midsummer Sioux, you have a much higher capacity to store heat. You have waves and currents that can break up ice. Late summer Sioux is much more prone to be covered in kind of like a deep perennial ice cover when it gets cold. So that's something to point out. I'm also going to talk about alkenones now. This is the work that I have had the most, or that I have done the most of in this project so far. Kind of an introduction to the proxy here. So alkenones are long chain ketones that are produced by haptophyte algae. I'm showing the actual molecules here. There are different types of alkenone producers. In this lake, we're looking at group 1, also known as Greenland type. And these alkenones are produced at multiple chain lengths, but in high abundance, it's C37, so that's 37 carbons in the chain. And these alkenone producers produce these long chain ketones with a different number of double bonds relative to single bonds, depending on the temperature. So here I'm showing a chromatogram, and we're looking at the abundance of tetra-unsaturated 4 double bonds relative to tri-unsaturated 3 double bonds, di-unsaturated 2 double bonds. And we use this index called UK37, which essentially quantifies the difference in abundance between these 3 unsaturated ketones. And that scales linearly with temperature in our lake water system. So here we can see that for every 1 degree change in temperature, we expect a 0.0287 change in the UK37 index. When applying this to Nedra, we find that there are some samples that produce unrealistically warm temperatures, which I'm highlighting in red. And that's because they have an incredibly large di-unsaturated peak. So here I'm plotting on the x-axis UK37, which we just looked at, and on the y-axis UK37 double prime, which essentially excludes the di-unsaturated in its calculations. And you can see that these two indices scale very linearly with each other for almost all of the samples, with the exception of these samples in red. And these are all from 6,400 years before present or deeper. And we also interpret this to be a result of low light turbid conditions caused by glacial meltwater influx. And so for the remainder of the talk, I'm just going to be talking about the records as they exist 6,400 years to present, because we just don't really have proxies after that time that work. All right, so this is our alkenone record. From peak to trough, we're looking at about 10 degrees, a 10-degree temperature change in the lake water itself. We see warming from about 6,500 years to 4,700 years before present, followed by an abrupt cooling, warming again, cooling again, warming again. I don't need to belabor the point or go through the whole record, but some interesting things that we can note are that the Independence 1 culture and the Greenlandic Dorset people both arrive in this area during a cold snap. and actually at the coldest temperatures in both of these cases. And they seem to abandon their sites or leave after or during a warming snap. This is pretty different than what we expected. Based on the landscape today, it seems to make more sense that you would need warmer conditions in order to thrive. But clearly, from this record, we can see that these ancient cultures were coming in during cold periods. Conversely, the Thule culture seems to be coming in and using this site during this kind of anomalously warm snap. Of course, the radiocarbon dates have some uncertainty, so we can't say that they necessarily came in right when that warm snap was starting and left right when it left, right when it was cool again. But we do see that there's a pretty incredible overlap. And this just kind of gets back to the point that although we have this general schematic for understanding that in certain climate conditions, resources are abundant, and in certain climate conditions, they aren't, those resources are really dependent on the cultures that are using them and what they are personally adapted to. Um, my hypothesis is that this gets back to sea ice. So whereas the Thule people need open seas or relatively open seas to hunt and to move, the Greenlandic Dorset people in the Independence One culture need that really stable land fast ice in order to traverse the landscape. So this points to the kind of critical next step in this project, which will be some sea ice modeling, and that's being done by Alan Condren at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. So how do our other records compare? So here I'm showing the late Summersue Alkinone UK37 record, and we can see it looks very, very different. So the Independence One culture, for example, overlaps with a period that is just missing alkenones. The black bars in this case show where we measured samples and they just didn't have any alkenones at all. The Greenlandic Dorset people seem to be aligning with a warm interval, and we didn't see this huge warming signal in our NEDRA record. So what's going on? Well, we have to remember that lake basin size and depth is really key. So late Summersue is prone to being covered in a thick perennial ice cover during cold periods, and that significantly impacts lake dynamics like heat exchange and stratification, more so than in a large system like Nedra Mid-Summersue. And if we align our diatom record, so here, just a reminder, up means less ice, so maybe warming, and down means more ice. So we can see that our alkenones essentially disappear during these periods of inferred ice loss. And then as soon as we kind of have this very stable, what we interpret to be more stable, constant ice cover, our temperatures warm. And again, I'm interpreting this as a reflection more so of changing lake dynamics and maybe lake warming beneath the ice surface, as opposed to changes in air temperature. So we think that Nedra is probably more representative of air temperature changes than late Summersue, but we can certainly learn something about the system from looking at this lake as well. All right, so putting all of our records together, here we're looking at Nedra alkenones on the top, late Summersue diatoms, which we're interpreting as ice cover, late Summersue alkenones, and these are calcium counts, which we got from iTrack's core scanning, XRF scanning of these cores. And we can see again that our inferred decrease in lake water temperature aligns with an inferred increase in ice cover. Sorry, this is in the wrong direction. With an inferred increase in ice cover. And we can also see that although there doesn't seem to be a real change in glacial melt or surface runoff at the onset of the Independence One occupation, we do see a significant change at the end. Again, it's unclear if these spikes are being caused by pulses of glacial melt as opposed to, let's say, precipitation events, sweeping sediment into the lake catchment. But there does seem to be kind of a fundamental state change around 3,700, 3,800 years before present when the Independence One people leave. This could be a decrease in storm frequency, or this could be that a glacier has retreated far enough during this warming interval that it's no longer providing meltwater flux into the catchment. Something interesting about this high frequency record, though, I'm now showing the GISP2 ice core record, sodium on the bottom, is that peaks in calcium flux into our lake basin align really well with sodium spikes in the GISP2 core. This is interesting. GISP2 is in central Greenland, and this proxy is widely interpreted to mean North Atlantic storminess. So it's still unclear to me as to why peaks in North Atlantic storminess would either lead to increased glacial meltwater flux or surface runoff caused by precipitation far away in northeast Greenland, and this is something that we're exploring. An important point to make also is that this temperature record that we have on the top is important as a local temperature record and looks quite different than other temperature reconstructions around Greenland. So here I'm showing a record that uses the same index, UK37, from alkenones in Bryasu Lake in West Greenland. And we can see that the temperature records really do not resemble each other at all. This record is from Kangerlussuaq, which I'm showing in the red box over here. And something to note is that the west coast of Greenland and Kangerlussuaq, in particular, temperature changes in this area are very much controlled in part by the North Atlantic Oscillation. I'm showing the positive phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation in panel C, and we can see that cooler temperature anomalies are associated with the west coast of Greenland, but that the northeast and the east coast are quite disconnected from that. And so this just kind of hammers home the point that having these local temperature reconstructions all around the Greenland ice sheet are actually quite critical for understanding temperature changes in each region, and getting a better understanding about how these temperatures changed in the past and also how they might affect ice melt in the future, or how these dynamics might affect ice melt in the future. Okay, so what is controlling our record then? If it's not what is controlling our record at GISP or on West Greenland, kind of to be determined. I'm working now to kind of understand the dynamic causes of climate change in this area in the past and in the present, but we think it has something to do with sea ice cover. So in Northeast Greenland and East Greenland, sea ice cover can exert a really strong control on changes in local climate. You can imagine that an ocean that is capped with ice is going to have a very different relationship with the atmosphere in terms of things like heat exchange and moisture exchange than one that is completely uncovered. And that can exert a very strong control on terrestrial climate parameters. And so this just gets back to the point of the importance of understanding sea ice in this area, both as a dynamical control on climate and also as a control on past habitability for the Thule people, Independence One people, Dorset people, etc. So that kind of concludes our climate records and what we have so far for that area. But what about hunting resources? I kind of said that we were working on this as well. We have two projects right now underway from the non-archaeological side of things. One of them is being led by Inger Alsos at the Arctic University of Norway up in Tromsø, where she is working on reconstructing mammalian sediment DNA in our lake cores to understand past changes in animal dynamics through time. And I am working on putting together a record of fecal steroid abundance in Late Summer Sioux Lake, to try to get at, again, the timing of arrival of musk oxen in this area and whether that then was a critical resource to people in the area, and potentially changing population dynamics. Something important to note, though, is that this is a very novel application in both cases. So these proxies have previously been applied primarily to agricultural or urbanized landscapes, where you can imagine that you would have a much higher flux of these things, of mammalian DNA, for example, or fecal steroids into a lake catchment as you would in comparison to a very, very barren landscape that has abundant drinking resources for these mammals, so they don't necessarily have to be drinking at this lake. Again, though, this points to the importance of having late summer Sioux as opposed to Nedra midsummer Sioux. If you look around the edges, there's a lot of vegetation, there's a lot of feces, there's a lot of things that are being swept into the lake catchment. And so this analysis is kind of just getting started from the fecal steroid side of things, but we are hopeful that we might be able to pick up a signal. So I'll talk briefly about our approach. So we're beginning with an analysis of fresh fecal samples from the area. We're lucky in that there aren't actually that many animals, so we don't have to analyze too many to understand if we can pick out a muskox signal specifically. So what we found from early analysis is that musk oxen produce a very high amount of DOC, that's deoxycholic acid, which I'm showing on the right, relative to other common bile acids like lithocholic acid, which I'm showing on the left. And from the feces we've analyzed so far, this seems to be unique to muskoxen. So we haven't seen that in Arctic hare, and we haven't seen it in geese. We still need to look at caribou, and we still need to look at fox. But this makes sense. Ruminants typically produce a large amount of DOC. And so we think that by looking at changes in flux of DOC through time, through our sediment core, which we analyze using GCMS, that we'll be able to hopefully understand at least when these animals arrive to the landscape. If I didn't say this earlier, I don't think I did. Bile acids are produced in the intestinal tracts of these animals. And all of these animals produce different bile acids in different proportions. So we can try to get a kind of a species-specific understanding of changes in animal density through time. Again, beginning with an analysis of modern samples. So that is this small project. It's kind of just getting started. I'm excited to see how it goes. Again, it's quite a novel application of this proxy. And if it works, that would be really incredible. And this is definitely an opportunity for proxy development here. So to conclude, sorry, this is a bit of a short talk, but to conclude, here is our alkinone record. We have found kind of our most exciting conclusion is that the Independence 1 and Greenlandic Dorset people seem to arrive during colder intervals, contrary to previous hypotheses or our previous hypotheses. Whereas the Thule people align with warm snap, which may explain why they were able to potentially sail from the northwestern part of Greenland or row from the northwestern part of Greenland over into Independence Fjord. This points to, of course, the importance of having a culturally specific understanding of habitability in this area, and that different resources might be important to different cultures. And we hypothesize that these trends might be due to the importance of sea ice, and the difference in the importance of sea ice to these different cultures. So again, Independence 1 people and Greenlandic Dorset people needing stable sea ice as their migration route, whereas Thule people needing passageways for them to be able to boat and voyage. To that point, future sea ice modeling will be critical for understanding past human migration, as well as dynamic causes of local climate change in the region. I showed some comparisons to temperature records from other parts of Greenland, that this is quite an isolated area that is probably, the climate of this region is probably significantly controlled by sea ice in the region. So that work is going to be very important, again, being done by Alan Condren at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And I also pointed out that this project has really kind of offered an opportunity for proxy development of alkenones, of bile acids, and of sedimentary DNA. For the latter two, because they just have not been applied in this way before to such a remote region. And these two proxy reconstructions can kind of feed off of one another and confirm or corroborate each other's findings. And alkenones, because we have this lake where we see that alkenone production and the UK37 index, not just abundance, but the index itself, seems to be strongly controlled by ice and lake dynamics, more so than changes in air temperature affecting lake water temperature itself. And so that presents an interesting opportunity for learning more about alkenones as a proxy and developing that further. So with that, I'll take questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Red. That was excellent. Very nice overview of what this project's all about. So I'll start off with questions from the group in Bergen. Andreas, do you have any questions from your group, or Willem?
Thank you. We need about 5 minutes if you could come back to us.
Okay, we'll come back. Any other groups that have questions? Do we have any questions here at United? Yes, go ahead. Phoenix, go ahead.
I'm thinking how important this is.
Okay. Hi. It was a really interesting talk. I'm curious if you could touch on the sediment DNA just a little bit. Are you looking for like pieces of hair that you can date? Or
No, the DNA is extracted from the sediment itself. It's not extracted from macrofossils within the sediment. I'm honestly not super familiar with the methodology, but that's being done by Inger Alsos at Tromsø. So yeah, it's a relatively new method of extracting DNA from bulk sediment as opposed to extracting it from individual macrofossils like you suggested.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add that Inger has done the analysis of the vegetation, as I understand it, and later this month we hope to get the mammalian, the spectrum of mammalian DNA that apparently involves a slightly different process of a slightly different methodology to process the data. So we should have an assessment that will be very valuable to compare with your bile acid data when that comes through.
Yeah.
Another question from here, Katie?
Yeah, I guess it's more of a comment. Hi, great talk. That was amazing. Super cool stuff. I'm like part of the Green Drill project, and I was actually just at Lamont the last 2 days. We didn't run into each other, but we're just talking about like how some of the dates are coming back, like mid-Holocene, with like maybe some northern hemisphere deglaciation there. I think they presented it on AGU last year with 1 data point so far, but hopefully this year some more.
Yes.
But yeah, so that was about like definitely earlier in time than what we're seeing, but I guess this is more of a comment, but it's very interesting to see like these people coming in after that point, when maybe like that's when Greenland started to like re-advance.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's just cool that those two could maybe be paired together, these two projects and stuff like. And
Yeah, I mean, there are people working on cosmogenic nuclide dating in this area to try to get at glacial histories in that way. Yeah, it's an interesting trade-off, right? Because like the valleys have to be ice-free enough, glaciers have to be retreated enough to allow passage, but you also need enough sea ice. So there's an interesting temperature dependence there. But yeah, we definitely have people working on that as well. I didn't mention it, but yeah.
Okay. Other questions from the group?
We're ready now. Bergen
Okay.
here. Oh,
Okay, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Thomas.
maybe you have to come a little closer to the microphone.
Yeah, sorry.
Hello. The first question is, if the first settlers depended on raising animals like musk ox, what do we know about past vegetations? Since you said it looked pretty better today.
Sorry, I didn't hear very well.
With the past vegetation.
Oh, past vegetation. We don't have a pollen record yet. I believe somebody's working on a pollen record right now. And we have Inger also at Tromsø working on a sedimentary DNA from vegetation as well. So there are efforts to kind of understand past vegetation trends in the area. It's just not something that's completed yet. Or I guess the vegetation DNA is in, so that'll be exciting to look at.
You know anything about how did the local topography to fjords and valleys influence the timing of the melting of the ice flows?
Oh, the melting of the ice loss. I'm honestly I'm not so sure about how that topography would have impacted like particular dynamics of glacial melt. Yeah, that's not something I've thought about too much, but an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the group? Okay, if not, well, thanks again, Red, for that talk. And for those of you who would like to invest some more time on that, you can check it out on the YouTube video channel, which is on our website. And next week we'll have a talk by
Guy Paxman.
Guy Paxman from Durham University, who's going to be talking about the Greenland ice configuration, I think, during the interglacial.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for participating, and we'll see you all again next week. Thanks again, Red.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Thank you, Red. Great talk. See you around.